I finished my last lecture with the paintings of Baroque Spain's superstar, Diego Velázquez. The College Board did not include other Spanish Baroque works in the list, at least Spanish works from Spain, but I worry that the focus on Velázquez is a little misleading. Velázquez was a court painter, but the biggest customer for art in Spain by far was the Catholic Church, and it is Spanish Baroque religious paintings that most deeply influenced Spanish colonial art, which is where we're heading now. So let's just glance at a few Spanish Baroque religious paintings. Zurbarán was contemporary of Velázquez, and again deeply influenced by my guy, Caravaggio. Ribera is one of my favorite Spanish painters. Note the Baroque elements, the diagonal lines, the dramatic use of chiaroscuro, the emphasis on a saint, go counter-reformers, the intentional foreshortening of figures that move out into our personal space, what we've been describing as open composition. It was Murillo, not Velázquez, who for centuries was the most admired Spanish Baroque painter. Note the resemblance to Raphael, to Rubens, even to Titian. We see more emphasis on color than line, softer outlines, and a more sentimental approach to the subject. Okay, now we finally get to cross the ocean. Today we will only briefly encounter civilizations that we will look at in much more detail in a later unit, the Aztec and the Inca. Both civilizations were thriving when the Spanish arrived in the 15th century, although European diseases, which had arrived a few years earlier, were already devastating the indigenous population. At any rate, the art we will study today is Mannerist and Baroque, but it was heavily influenced by contacts with the Aztec and Inca empires, and with Spain's new colony in the Philippines, which brought the New World into contact with the civilizations of China and Japan. I'm going to ask you to watch this rather long crash course clip because it manages to give us a preview of the Aztecs and Incas, introduce the Spanish Empire, and review what's happening in 17th century Europe all in about 7 minutes. Even I can't talk that fast. Back to the disembodied voice. Franciscan missionaries traveled to the New World at least as early as Columbus's second voyage, and from the very beginning, Spain was committed to winning its inhabitants to Roman Catholic Christianity. This is a complicated story with some real Christian heroes. Almost all of the efforts to protect indigenous people from forced labor, slavery, and other atrocities were led by priests, and sometimes the priests cooperated with mistreatment and oppression. It's too long a story to tell here, but I do want to explore one very important document, if only briefly. The Spanish requirement, or requerimiento, Ms. Jacobs can correct my pronunciation, was by order of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella read to peoples that the Spaniards conquered or otherwise encountered. So here you see the opening paragraph. What mixed message does this send? Well, subduers of barbarous nations isn't very subtle, although you should remember that Ferdinand is referring at least as much to subduing the Moors that he had just expelled from Spain as to Aztecs and other indigenous people. But note that the last part of the paragraph also establishes a kinship between Spaniards and their new subjects. It is sort of a declaration of Christian brotherhood. Now here's another double message. On the one hand, both the king and his subjects must obey a higher authority, St. Peter and his spiritual descendants, the popes. But of course, the popes gave the kings authority over these new subjects. And the final double message is, by all means, take your time, think over the claims of this new religion, be persuaded by the truth of what we are saying, or else we're going to make war on you, enslave your wives and children, and take all your goods. I think we'll see that this confusing dual communication of promise and threat, brotherhood and subjection carry through into the art of Spanish colonial America. You saw in the video that Spain divided its conquered territories into viceroyalties. Of the 4 we will look at today, 3 hail from the Viceroyalty of New Spain, headquartered in Mexico City and heavily influenced by contacts with the Aztecs and the people they conquered. But we will begin with a work from what began as the Viceroyalty of Peru. And no, this isn't the College Board required work. It is in your workbook because it's my favorite Spanish colonial Baroque work, probably because it's one I've actually seen in the Cathedral of Cusco, Peru. Zapata was himself Quechuan, or Inca. He and other indigenous painters learned mostly from prints of European paintings, and their style tends to blend local culture into the traditional painting of the conquistadors. Their paymasters, by the way, were the Roman Catholic Church. I think you can all recognize the iconography of the Last Supper. But some Incan elements have snuck in. The meat on the platter is cuy, or guinea pig. Cuy was the animal traditionally sacrificed at Inca agricultural festivals, so it offers a parallel to the lamb, the traditional Christian and Jewish sacrificial animal. The dinner beverage is not wine, but a traditional Peruvian drink, chica, made from maize. Like Caravaggio, the artist is bringing Christ in to the recognizable lives of ordinary people, his people. But did the artist also manage to work in a critique of the conquerors? Note the figure of Judas. I've circled him in green, and you'll see that he's clutching a money bag underneath the table. This Judas bears a striking resemblance to Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador credited with capturing and murdering the Inca Empire Atahualpa. Okay, this is the required work, and it's one of a very interesting group of paintings that I never knew existed before I started teaching this new curriculum. If you were to see this painting without any kind of a background, what period would you assign it to? Well, I think it looks Mannerist, with the elaborate clothes, the soft, limp hands, even though they're holding a gun, and the distorted body. The head is too small, the body is too large. But the elaborate treatment of the textiles may also point to a Flemish influence. So what's with that costume? The outfit is probably mostly inspired by the Viceroy Guards uniforms. They were the only regular military force in the region. The painting on the right shows the guard escorting the Viceroy. The angel's jacket uses more cloth. That's a traditional way of showing off wealth. But the angel's costume also includes elements of Incan royalty's traditional ceremonial costumes, which use feathers and brightly patterned woven textiles. This gun-toting angel, also by the master of Calamarca, offers a better comparison. The figure on the right is dressed in traditional royal Inca garb for the Inti Raymi, or sun ceremony. Actually, these gun-toting angels showed up in paintings all through the Andean region. Here are three more. Interestingly, the Catholic Church, after the Council on Trent, had decided to crack down on angels. They were too closely associated with magic and superstition, so artists were actually increasingly discouraged from putting them into paintings. But in the Americas, interest in angels was actually on the rise. Magic spirits had always played an important role in indigenous religion, and angels offered the church an opportunity to grab their would-be converts' attention with something that seemed magical. And not just angels. What was more magical than those arquebuses, or muskets, which conquistadors had used to overwhelm much larger indigenous armies? In the Counter-Reformation spirit of triumphal imagery, the arquebus also symbolized the conquering power of the Catholic Church. But miracles are not the same as magic, and the Catholic Church readily embraced miracles, especially those involving the Virgin Mary. My students all know this story. They attend Juan Diego Catholic High School, after all. The year was 1531. Cortez had conquered Mexico City just a decade earlier, but Franciscan missionaries had already won many converts to the Catholic faith, and one of them was an Indian peasant farmer named Juan Diego. Juan Diego was walking to Mass along Tepeyac Hill when he began to hear beautiful strains of music. He looked up and he saw a beautiful lady who called his name. She introduced herself as the Virgin Mary and explained that she wanted a church built on this location in her honor. Juan Diego went off to see the bishop, which must have required some courage, but the bishop proved skeptical and asked for a sign. Mary then told Juan Diego to go to the top of the mountain and pick some flowers. He went up to the hill, which was dry and barren, a place where only cactus grew. There he found roses like those grown in Castile in Spain, foreign to Mexico. He gathered the flowers in his tilma, a garment like a poncho. He brought them to Mary, who arranged the flowers and said to take them to the bishop. When Juan Diego opened his tilma in the bishop's presence, the bishop saw not just the flowers of Spain, but the image of the Virgin. The church, no surprise, was promptly built. The images in the roundels in this work surrounding the Virgin tell the tale of Juan Diego that I've just related, admittedly in an abridged form. So here's the image of the Virgin that now resides in the Shrine of Guadalupe. The church was built on the site of a temple to the Aztec mother goddess, which the Spaniards had destroyed. More, not very subtle symbolism of the Catholic Church's competing power. So where does the imagery come from? One answer is the book of Revelation. Here's the passage. But the images also had great significance within the Aztec culture. So, for example, Mary's flowery tunic symbolized earth, while her turquoise starry mantle or cloak represented the heavens. The mantle also indicated that she's royalty, since only native emperors wore cloaks of that color. The three suns associate the Virgin with light and potent power of the sun, very important to Aztec belief. The black ribbon around Mary's waist shows she is expecting a child. And for the Aztecs, the trapezoid-shaped ends of the ribbon represented the end of one cycle and the birth of a new era. This was a civilization, as we will see, fascinated by calendars. Finally, the flowers on Mary's dress are made up of glyphs that represent a hill and a river. The Aztecs considered hills the highest point of encounter between God and people. An angel with eagle's wings appears below Mary's feet. According to Aztec legends, an eagle delivered the hearts and blood of sacrificial victims to the gods. The angel holds up the pregnant virgin, signifying that the child in her womb is an offering that pleases God. And looking ahead to our Art of the Americas unit, on the right, you see the Aztec goddess Coatlicue. According to the legend, she was magically impregnated while still a virgin by a ball of feathers that fell on her while she was sweeping a temple. But note that all of these Aztec symbols also conform to the passage in Revelation and to symbols commonly associated with the Virgin. Our required work isn't actually the famous image in the Guadalupe shrine, but rather a copy made in the enconchado style with inlaid mother of pearl. This was a technique invented in Mexico but inspired by Japanese art. Latin America and Asia, as you saw in the video, were closely linked in this period because Spanish treasure ships regularly brought Mexican silver to Asia and Asian goods to Mexico. This work is signed by Miguel Gonzalez, who along with his brother Juan was considered the foremost painter of encochados. Note that this image depicts the Virgin placed atop an eagle who is perched on a cactus. Mexico City's legendary coat of arms. This points to the Virgin of Guadalupe's increasing association with Mexican identity. And, speaking of encochado, we're moving to our next work, also from Mexico. I just talked about Mexico's ties with Asia via the Philippines and the influence of Japanese art, in particular the art of Japan. On the art of Mexico. This work employs encochado, or shell inlay, but it combines this with another Asian-influenced but also Mexican genre, the biombo, or folding screen. This work was commissioned by the Viceroy of New Spain and was probably displayed in Mexico's Viceregal Palace, where it would have been divided a ceremonial stateroom from a more intimate sitting room. This is the side that important political visitors would have seen. The Khan Academy video on this work is really excellent, so I hope you watched it. I'm just going to fill in a few more details. The victory portrayed was the 1688 Battle for Belgrade. I mention the date because it took place just before this work was created. This is a current news flash, and also because, as it turns out, there were lots of battles for Belgrade. Some of them the Europeans won, some of them the Turks won. No surprise, the Holy Roman Empire won this one. But they actually lost Belgrade again 2 years later in 1690, and I wonder how the Viceroy explained that one to his guests. At any rate, control of Belgrade went back and forth until 1806, when the Europeans got it back for good, and today Belgrade is the capital of Serbia. The level of detail in this work is extraordinary. You saw some of that on the Khan Academy video, and I've blown up a few other portions. Here's a nice bloodthirsty scene of European heads on poles being handed up to the Turks. The Khan Academy video mentioned that the scene from the Great Turkish War of 1683 to 99 was based on a Dutch print. And here it is. These prints, especially cheaper black and white versions, were very popular with Dutch citizens who were following the wars in Europe with great interest. There was no CNN back in those days, remember? So if this was the side that faced the formal reception room, what message did it send? Don't mess with the Habsburgs. The gold paint, the shell inlay, the shiny black paint imitating lacquer would also have showcased the viceroy's wealth, and of course with that the wealth of Spain. This was back before electricity. Think of how candlelight would have flickered off these shining surfaces. What other works have we studied that are designed to create a similar effect? How about mosaics? The decorative hunting scene on the reverse side was better suited for the more intimate women's sitting room that it faced. The hunt scene is based on the Medici court artist's designs for tapestries in Cosimo I's villa. Both the main scene and the decorative borders are embellished with gold paint and inlaid shellwork. Again, more sparkle by candlelight. What's most interesting about this work is that it's influenced by Dutch and Japanese art, produced in Mexico by local artists using local materials that imitate Japanese techniques. This is globalization, already well underway. And this leads amazingly well into our final Spanish colonial work for this unit. Actually, I realize now that I probably should have stuck this painting into the next unit, because this is really a work of a slightly later period than the Baroque, although thematically it fits here. So here's a trailer for our next unit. It is all about scientific inquiry and rationalism. Remember how I talked about each artistic generation trying to one-up the previous one? These folks were tired of Go for Baroque and its appeal to emotions. Back to reason, thank you very much. And though it seems odd and more than a little offensive to us, this and other so-called Casta paintings in part reflected the spirit of scientific inquiry. Think of your elementary school chemistry projects. What happens when you mix baking soda and vinegar? But of course, the Casta paintings also carried a message about racial superiority. In fact, Mexican Creoles, that is, Mexicans of Spanish descent, who hoped to gain more power in Spain, often criticized these paintings. Any theories about why? Well, they were worried that the king and his court back in Spain would conclude the Creoles were mixed race, and that would weaken their claim to rule themselves. So here is a complete Casta tableau that hung in the Madrid Museum of Natural History. Note, natural history, not art, in the early 1800s. People would have examined it the way we examine dinosaur bones and Anasazi rope sandals. It wasn't art, it was science. The tableau should be read from top to bottom, and note our old friend the Virgin of Guadalupe is hovering protectively over all of these people. The couples in the top row all have at least one European member. Note the elegant clothing. Even the Indian woman in this painting is clearly upper caste, perhaps like the viceroy's wife, an Aztec princess. Move further down the tableau and the people get darker, the clothing becomes simpler, and in many cases, it isn't clear here, the occupations become less elevated. The Casta paintings were often produced in sets of 16. Notice that the descendants of Africans appear at the bottom, and notice how the clothing shifts. So here on the left, you see a mestizo and an Indian with their children. They're dressed in peasant garb, and the donkey and produce suggests that they are farmers. The Negro and the Indian are shown with fruits and vegetables native to regions where many descendants of Africans lived. Again, remember, this is meant to be scientific documentation. So are these paintings entirely insulting to the persons portrayed as belonging, quite literally, to lower races? Well, the whole enterprise is off-putting to our modern sensibilities, but I'd argue that the paintings themselves are surprisingly sympathetic portraits of the families. Remember, too, that these religious people would have been familiar with paintings of the Holy Family. It strikes me that there's more than a little resemblance here. But now we're going to leave the world of Catholic Europe and its colonies and return for our last lecture to the new heart of the Protestant Revolution, the Netherlands.